Hello, it's 3:21 in the morning. I have to be up at 8 a.m. to go to the DMV, but delayed sleep phase. So at this point, I'm just going to power through. So I figured I'd record an update as week one of the Tales Kickstarter comes to a close. It's been a good week as the campaign goes, despite the catastrophic floods on day one and apocalyptic everything. Last I checked, we were pushing 7K. So that 15K stretch goal, for hardcover seems like it might be within reach. This video isn't about that. I want to talk here about the earlier days of this project, where it came from, what it came out of. If you listen to my launch day video, you know a sliver of this story already in regards to my personal life. I'm going to talk here more about sources of inspiration, the origin of ideas, and the various stages that projects can take. Maybe also what incited the creative fugue that kicked this thing off. No pun. And so obviously Tales has been through many phases over the years, so it'd be hard to identify all of them. It officially began in 2014, but it has its roots in a couple slightly earlier projects. It might have started to congeal back in 2013 with Words of Traders. We funded that off of a successful little 2K Indiegogo. I meant it to be a quick and messy way to churn up new ideas. Words of Traders consisted of a bunch of short vignettes and illustrations, an assemblage of art from a number of different artists. Philly artist James Dupree contributed a colorful cover. UK-based Laurie Lipton contributed one. She's awesome. A number of others. It was written like a short story anthology, but I was the author of them all. It was mostly written from inside the head of various characters, in the moment, in seemingly disparate stages of transition. It was meant to be sketchy, something I had to do quickly enough that I wouldn't belabor it like I can do. That could come later, once I'd effectively funded the first draft. I wanted to do something that I didn't have the opportunity to rework. The results were horribly uneven, but I think also kind of raw and visceral. So I think it was, at least on my end, a worthwhile experience. I was in a major transitional phase in my own life. Maybe some of the writing was processing that through the lens of a variety of purely fictional characters. That was kind of the trick there. A lot of the situations and content was based on things I'd experienced or witnessed, but they were all told by people who were very much not me. So after Words of Traders wrapped, I wound up pulling a number of those shorts as rough drafts for what would become the first novel in the Fallen Cycle mythos, Party at the World's End. They helped round out an earlier film script rewrite by the same name after it had been written, optioned, and shelved. Survivorship bias is a huge factor in terms of success with this kind of work. That could be a deep dive in itself, but Google it if you're not familiar. I found the places where the Words of Traders characters' stories intersected with those in Party at the World's End, so those vignettes could give more of a sense of place for the more kind of action-oriented material from the film script. And it also lifted a storyline from a previous novella, a rough draft originally called the 404 Documents. There's a canonical sort of event in the Fallen Cycle world called the 404 attacks, and yet it's also sort of something that never happened. It was like a sort of a mimetic virus, which at the time when it was written in like 2010 seemed like it was kind of an out there thing, but I think now it's pretty clear what that's all about. So that became the B story in Party at the World's End. A series of events that happen a couple years before the rest of the events in the story, but were kind of run back to back with it. But hey, if the The Witcher can do it, right? Um, I use the obviously kind of collage mentality for everything. It's just how my head works. What happens when you put these elements together in this way, or what about that way? Reassemble, rearrange, reframe until that assemblage sort of hits the balance point between chaos and order, or maybe entropy and order. I don't generally like perfect symmetry. Something has to be kind of out of place or something slightly undone. My earliest novel, Join My Cult, was primarily noise or entropy. The reader had to kind of impose the order. Nowadays, I'm more interested in the balance between what you get when you free up your brush strokes or write in a kind of free associative mode, and what you get when you're incredibly, regimental and structured. That's just a metaphorical kind of left and right brain duality. I used to be fond of Nietzsche's idea of the Apollonian and Dionysian art. I guess I still am. Anyway, one of the stories in Words of Traders was about a character named Nissa. The idea was from a pitch I made to a film production company in 2010 or 2011. Didn't make it to a full script. I think one of the first mood inspirations for Nissa might have been listening to She Wants Revenge tracks or something like that. Maybe not. On its surface, the Nissa story that appears in Words of Traders kind of has a pretty straightforward twist. It seems that the protagonist, this video store clerk who writes in his spare time, is starting to obsess over and then stalk this girl, college age, which he rationalizes as character research for a story that he's going to write. But that she winds up killing him. Hunter becomes hunted, etc. There's an inkling of her not being human in that final scene, though it's when he's dying, so it could also be his hallucination. In reflecting on that story, I felt like there was a more interesting kind of story hiding behind this character who appeared there so briefly, and seen through the eyes of a very unreliable narrator. At the same time, so I guess that's 2013 or 14, I was working on a mother maiden crone motif concept for early development with a video game pitch with a Russian artist named Alexei Andreev. That also didn't pan out, although one or two of the early concept pieces from that have made their way into the current edition of Tales, at least kind of integrated with a couple two-page spreads, the Spring Tree. So I guess I gave myself away there a little bit, but I imagine you know where this is going now. The characters in those notes, at that point, Nadia, her absent mother, and her grandmother became the origins of the Aitas, Gran and her granddaughter. Apparently my cats are appreciating that, who was named after her. So then the question I asked myself is, what happens if you put these three in a story together, along with a fourth point of view character who's an outsider with their world and who's very much the worse for having stumbled into it. So everything in Tales would ultimately be arranged kind of in patterns of 4, 3 plus 1 uncommon element, like the 3 types of feign, the Tovag, Chatilian, and Melier, or 7s, 4 and 3. I'll get into that more in a subsequent video on cosmology. So where are we in the chronology now? Late 2014. I'd built Party at the World's End out of those parts and released it. I took it on the road to some cons. 2015, my attention turned to a journalism startup that was full bore for about 8 months, and then kind of hit a wall. But in the background, in notebooks, during this time, Tales was already clearly gestating. But it still wasn't really clear to me exactly what form it would take. I remember I wrote an early draft in like comic, format, sequential art fully, but then I realized that Gran and Elwayne's voice demanded that it be in prose, so it would be, it's either be doing a disservice to their voice or doing a disservice to the format. So I adapted, and I think a fairy tale sort of approach to the layout actually makes more sense with the story anyways. Even though it's posed a little bit of problem with some publishers because there's a very kind of hard-nosed sense of comics are this format, and publisher only deals with this, and then the fiction publishers don't deal with picture books. So it's very regimented in that way, and that's part of why I think going to Kickstarter has been a great move for this project. Kind of at the very least prove that this is something that can work. So in 2016, obviously January, Bowie died. I jumped into researching masks, Bowie, and artists of artifice so fast that by the time I realized I was working on some kind of book, there was already a pretty substantial interest from scholars to contribute. We got a bunch of original research and some reprints, like from Slavoj Žižek and John Gray. We did some interviews, like with former Blondie member and current author Gary Lachman, David De Angelis, who worked with Bowie on the Art for Outside, which is one of my favorite Bowie albums, by the way, but that's a subject for another day. That morphed seamlessly into an anthology subsequently released by Intellect Books, Masks, in 2020. During those years and before them, really, I had a lot of exposure to the works of David Bowie and also Yukio Mishima, who was one of the several artists we focused on, and I'm sure that had a major influence in the form Tales would ultimately take. In particular, Mishima's rather twisted relationship with his grandmother. I wouldn't say the relationship between Aita and her grand was modeled off of it directly, but it was a seed idea. That dynamic could probably be the subject for a video in itself. But if you're interested, I highly recommend Jonathan Nathan's Mishima biography, especially where the dynamic of the relationship is concerned, and also the Stokes Life and Death of Mishima, I think it's called. You can probably find a couple decent documentaries, or half decent at any rate, on YouTube. So in reflecting on the path of the early development of Tales, it was pretty clear from the get-go that the two projects, Masks and Tales, were conceptually connected. Like I was working through a problem or an idea or whatever you want to call it from two directions at once. Masks was a place to collect my more, philosophical thoughts on the subject of the tricky conundrum that being an artist in the commodified world creates. You're expected to create a simulacra of yourself in the public eye. But if that, simulacra or double becomes famous, it can have some distorting effect on the psyche and on your relationships. It's hard to resist. And that got me thinking about identity in general in a different way than I had before, I think. And also in a more kind of fundamental sense. Persona is something we can't entirely take off and remain a social animal of the sort that we are. One mask removed reveals another in that immediate sense. Right now, I'm approaching these videos authentically. I'm not doing a podcast voice, or I couldn't even do it. That's the thing. That's not me doing a shtick, of that sort. Certainly not this age, anyways. Come to me when I was still a goth kid, 1990s. This is just me, tired after a long day of inking and painting and wandering about and mumbling to myself and role playing and possibly hypothetically a little stoned. But the very framework of this interaction we're having right now demands that it be some sort of performance. And also there are those kind of shamanic implications of the mask, which plays a part in Masks, the book. And for all of these things, I got to go much further with these ideas and tales, if in a very different way, because fantasy makes fewer demands, I guess, of that kind. The form that Masks took was kind of dictated by the demands of academic publishing, and kind of focused through the life and work of other artists, whereas Tales was a place for me to give those ideas more free license. In a way, Tales is probably my least philosophical book to date. I think it's also the first novel I've written that isn't in some convoluted, indirect way about me or about my experience. Of course, this is a known phenomenon for first and second novels. Tales is my third. And it's impossible to not include ourselves in a writing to some extent, but my experience isn't the focus anymore. I did use the name of a character I used to play in D&D for one of the characters in the story. I guess as a kind of joke to myself. Let's see if you can determine which one it was. But otherwise, none of the characters in the story are a cipher for me or like an alternate identity. I guess I feel like I took the idea as far as I want to in some of my previous work, for now anyways. I talked about this a little on launch day. It was written primarily while I was trying to come to terms with how chronic illnesses had changed my place in the world, and also coming aware of things that had kind of been a factor in my life for all my life, and I just didn't realize what they were. And neither did anyone else. I came out the other end with very different priorities than when I came in. The society we live in is really, that's really what makes disability a kind of oftentimes hellish, experience. So it's not like I recommend it. But I think it has humbled me a great deal, and that's changed the artwork I've done through the process. And I think in some ways it's improved it. It's made me more patient in terms of reworking it. I still, tend to work in tangents, but, with Tales, for instance, I was, obviously willing to keep working it until it was ready. And even now it still has to go through an editorial process, and, so anyways, I'm getting off on a tangent, as I'm prone to do. None of the point of view characters are alter egos or alternates. That was my point. So is that a little like taking, the mask off? Or maybe that's a little simplistic, but it's still salient to the theme. So that's a little piece of what I got out of it. So by 2016 to 2017, I knew, most of the ingredients I was going to be cooking with for Tales. Through the years of this project, I spent a lot of time just soaking up various ideas and letting my hyperfocus run wild with where those connections took me. Consequently, there's a lot of seed ideas from all over, from mythology, Dhumavati, from Hinduism, Baba Yaga, from north of there, Lilith, of course. I think this book is, and it's probably the last one I'm going to do with her centered in any way for a while. And even this one, she wasn't a point of view character. But it's been fun, I suppose. I treat her character as a hybrid of new and the sort of older ideas about the character that exist through history and myth, perhaps with some unique twists. But like Dionysus, who appears in Party at the World's End, just painting them as symbols of liberation and freedom is missing the point. He's also the god of madness and of homicidal fury, although not necessarily of his own. Although it's not essential to have read it, Tales completes the arc of Lilith's character in Party at the World's End. You get to know, you get to find out, kind of why she did what she did. At least in some sense, her mad gambit worked. Let's see, what else? I spent years reading and researching the early days of Russia, the Mongolians, and other steep nomad cultures, the Silk Road. That interest had me up all night listening to music from Yakutia or going to performances of 16th century Ottoman music at the nearby conservatory when I was living in Boston. Viking myth, history, Icelandic, Seder, sort of magical system, Central and Northern Asian shamanic cultures. But let me be clear on this point, because it's a pretty important one. I wasn't trying to portray those people or their cultures in Tales at all. It doesn't seem to be for me. Instead, I kind of did the opposite of what I was doing in my more academic research for masks, in terms of the sort of conceptual objective, and steep myself in what pulled my attention, and let the story itself and the illustrative process dictate how that influence came out. It clearly affected it, but you're not going to learn anything, particularly, historically accurate about traditional shamanic practices. You might learn a bit about chaos magic, and quite a bit about Fallen Cycle's own unique cosmology, which could very well serve for ritual work, ritual use if you were so inclined. So my lifelong interest in the occult is similarly a vein that I sometimes look to mine for fiction. And to some extent, that process is reversed to the extent that fiction can affect the real world. But that isn't to say that I think the two processes are equivalent. It was and is very important to me to maintain the falseness of fantasy as well as its inner truths, because it's in the ways that it diverges from our own world that we can find the greatest extent of creative freedom. And that's kind of the power and the allure and the danger of fantasy. It's in the process of engaging with the story, and really engaging with it. The reader brings that full circle. It's only through that you recreate that fantasy, how it re-enters the world and can become real in the way that it does. So, with all that said, let's take a little walk through the old notebooks. So these are old notebooks. This first one is mostly, I think, from like 2014 to 16. Usually a lot of these are just kind of doodles or sometimes character sketches, but a lot of times more just working out ideas early on. I shared most of this with the artist I was collaborating with, at least the stuff that was relevant to sort of get started. So you'll see motifs or imagery that actually appears in the final work, even though it doesn't look like this, because these are all kind of just hand-drawn sketches. This is an early one of Lilith and New Babylon, just playing around with that. And Aita's time in the underworld. Similarly, there's a period when she's, Aita's in the underworld that she encounters Lilith. In the final comic, she doesn't wind up looking quite so kind of dark as this. I think I wanted her to seem fairer and feel fouler, as the thing from Lord of the Rings goes. There's another one. And all these were sort of still kind of trying to get a sense of the characters and just kind of where I was with them. This was a sketch of Nyssa, but also sort of a really early cosmology where it was just two, with one in the middle, three-part cosmology with the material. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit there. The material world, and then the underworld underneath it. Also an early sketch of Owain. It was kind of more spider motifs and stuff. And I stopped doing that. This is an early map of Alteron, the second world. The second world is basically kind of what the Fey realms, what Alteron is turned into once humans wind up sort of colonizing it. If inadvertently. And also the Fane came there before the humans, but they sort of, by the time they arrived, the Fae were already gone. Let's see here. This one is a concept that kind of played into a scene in Party at the World's End, where Dionysus is sort of consumed, which is a motif that appears throughout Bacchae, both the Bacchae play, but also the mythology of Dionysus. It's pretty recognized symbolism. I really dug this one. So much going on in this one, though. I wound up not. I was going to use it as a painting. I was going to build it into a painting, but I wound up not. Partially because just all the pieces. There's a modern train, an Alteron second world style train, the hearts stitched together. I see a lot of the symbols that appear again and again. The raven. Old House of Bones sketch. Sketch from a critical scene in Party at the World's End at Mount Rushmore. And Elena and the Sisters of Babylon, I was kind of playing with this idea of them having a sort of mind battle, which does wind up actually appearing in some form, and at least in the manuscript as it is now. Here's the four-world diagram. This motif appears again and again, both in the art and the structure of the story. And in my sketches, as I sort of start to hammer out, what the worlds are and how the Fane relate to the, different worlds and so on. This was back when it was still Nadja. I don't know if you see that note in the corner. And another four up. At this point, see the Chatillon, the Tovag, the Melier, and Lilith, who has sort of subsumed the role of the fourth here. As I was saying, there's patterns of 3 and then 1 on the outside. Here I was drawing sort of New Babylon, but I was also at the same time sketching out a bunch of ideas. A lot of my note-taking, like I said, wound up taking this sort of hybridized, image and text, especially when I'm trying to get the feel of things. Grand's, back then, Nadja's cottage, from the very beginning I had this image of it being built into the tree, into the roots of a tree, to juxtapose against the summer tree, which she arises from the summer tree. That's how she enters the second world. A sketch of Highmount, which is a settlement in Chernaya, the kingdom that's kind of on the top of a huge plateau. And so you see these kind of like steampunky sort of elevators that go up and down. This is a drawing. A kind of similar layout was used by Peter for one of the illustrations that we have now for the fall tree, of Elena kind of looking on as the survivors from the collapsed city are walking out towards the Great Divide. You see some of this sketch worked its way into one of the paintings that you'll see. Also a sort of little sketch, another grand early sketch. The idea of her hair being like literally tree roots was kind of early on, but then I thought, we'll just go with sort of dready thing, and no, it doesn't fit in the story, at least in the parts that are supposed to conform somewhat to the rules of our world. And here also, playing with cosmology, the fall tree, the winter tree, the spring tree, the summer tree, 4 up, the second world. This is the underworld. Down here, the land of the dead, and Lilith's maze in between. Yet another second world map. Let's see, I think that's most of the, sort of relevant ones in here. There is like a little sketch we're starting to work on integrating the 4 worlds and the Fane with the Fallen, which is a pattern of 12. And that's kind of graded along the triplicities of the zodiac. We'll get into that more in the cosmology stuff for those who want to geek out in that direction. I don't expect these videos are for everyone, but I think for the people who are kind of, in this vein, hopefully we'll find something useful in it. And this is the second notebook. I think these, they weren't entirely chronological, but I think this was certainly a little bit later. By this point, it was Gran Aita, and the characters were fairly set, at least. This is a sketch of Nissa. Let's see. Very, very early sketch of Ashanti, which is the city of the Amari. Another sketch of Aita. This is around the age when she was dating Nissa, however briefly. Gran Aita sketch. This is one of the later ones that I sent over to Chris and Peter when I was kind of like, all right. And Peter went with a slightly more sort of Baba Yaga-ish look for her. That's one thing I liked about it, was being able to have slightly different takes on the same character through the eyes of and hands of different artists. Another Gran Aita concept sketch. Trees. Let's see. Younger Aita. kind of more of a hairstyle reference for the artist than anything. Let's see, what else we got here? Here, you're not going to be able to see the details, but is me working out cosmology stuff, associations, relationships, the creation of the world. These things are also, I'm trying to grid them it's like they're all in patterns of 3 and 4 that each, I guess you could say, cultural people of the second world have a slightly different take on it. So I was kind of trying to think through that from their different vantage points. To the extent that it intersects with the story, it winds up in the book. A lot of it's also going to be stuff that's, at least theoretically, more relevant once we get to building setting and rule books for the RPG, if we get to that point. Had a really good Fallen Cycle RPG session tonight, actually. I was happy that's continuing to go strong. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's mostly it for this sketchbook. I have a couple others, but I think that's what I'm going to share for now. So I think that does it for this week's, at least, wrap-up video. Kind of much longer than I expected it to be in some ways, although I guess I kind of also assumed that it was going to be really long. It has been 7 years of work, so I've abridged it as much as I could. But I hope this retrospective was informative or interesting or some such. I'm going to get into the second world and Alteron and the foreworld cosmology in the next video that I intend to do. If you're into occultism or into mythology in particular, that should be a treat. If not, I guess we'll see. Until then,